Good evening and welcome to this special edition of the India and the World webinar series hosted by Carnegie India. The image in green through the lens of night vision goggles of the last US officer stepping onto the last military transport aircraft out of Afghanistan is one that will stay in the minds of many for years to come. The images and videos of Taliban special operators and their political masters walking around the tarmac looking for aircrafts and equipment left over is equally challenging. The government of Qatar is in discussions to reopen the airport. India's ambassador to Qatar met recently with the head of the Taliban political office in Doha. Various UN agencies have highlighted the desperate and urgent need for humanitarian assistance, and the Taliban appear to be in the midst of organizing a new government, ostensibly an inclusive government that could be announced any moment now. In the meanwhile, conflicting reports from Pakistan oscillate between celebration for the new dispensation, shock at the speed with which the Taliban made their way into Kabul, and perhaps a degree of hesitancy in what this means for stability within Pakistan in the long term. To discuss these issues, I'm joined by two leading experts, Dawood Azami and Joshua White. Josh is a non-resident fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He is also, or I should say, he is mainly perhaps an associate professor of the practice of South Asian Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Josh previously served at the White House as senior advisor and director for South Asian Affairs at the National Security Council, where he staffed the president and the National Security Advisor on a full range of South Asia-related issues. Prior to joining the White House, Josh was a senior associate and co-director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. He has held visiting positions at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, LUMS, the International Islamic University in Islamabad, Pakistan's National Defense University, and the Institute for Defense and Strategic Analyses in Delhi. I think it's fair to say that there are few who understand Pakistan and South Asia more broadly, not only in the Western world, but in the world in general, better than Josh White. Dr. Dawood Azami is a senior journalist and academic. As a multimedia editor in the BBC's World Service in London, he leads a team of journalists covering international news and current affairs. He has taught at the University of Westminster and Ohio State University, and has written several investigative articles and journals on social, security, and political issues. Dawood got a PhD in the field of politics and international relations. He has 3 master's degrees in various areas, from international relations to politics and literature to diplomacy. In addition to the coverage of daily news in the BBC, he has produced and presented several special documentaries on a range of issues. I've known Dawood for a very long time, and we're very glad that we have an Afghan expert on India and the world with us today. I'm going to start first with perhaps Dawood before I move to Josh. Dawood, if I could just come to the question that many are thinking about right now, which is that what is the new Taliban government going to look like? And if I can take it a step further, why has it taken them this long to try and figure out what that government might look like or to announce it to the world?
Well, thank you very much, Rudra, for your kind and generous introduction. And it's an honor to be with you and discuss an important topic. Come back to your question. I'll first talk about the reasons for the delay to announce the new government. So first of all, it was a shock for the Taliban themselves. They were also surprised with the speed with which the previous government collapsed. They were not ready for this kind of scenario, and they didn't expect that this will happen so soon. So that's why they didn't prepare for this scenario. And the second reason was the presence of foreign forces. They were in Afghanistan until the 31st of August, and the Taliban said publicly that they wouldn't announce the government until all the foreign forces leave Afghanistan. The third reason was internal. They needed to have internal discussions to decide who gets what. And there are so many new positions vacant to be filled, and there are a lot of power to distribute. And that's why they needed some time to discuss these issues. And they had a meeting in Kandahar on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, a 3-day meeting in which the members of the Leadership Council and the Supreme Leader discussed all these issues, and they said that we have reached a consensus. And the fourth reason was the ongoing discussion between the Taliban and other political leaders and factions. The Taliban had said that they would form an inclusive government. They would consult with other political leaders and factions. So that was another reason. And the fifth reason was the reactions and the demands of the international community. So they want to be careful. They didn't want to rush to announce their government or the form of government. So these were the 5 or 6 main reasons that that we are seeing this delay on the part of the Taliban to announce the new government. As far as the structure of the new government is concerned, I think the supreme leader or the main leader of the Taliban will stay supreme. He will have most of the power. He will be the overall leader of the new government. And then he has got 3 deputies. 2 were focused mainly on military affairs. Mullah Muhammad Yaqub and Sirajuddin Haqqani were 2 of the deputies who were leading the fight against the Afghan government and its international allies. The 3rd deputy was Mullah Abdul Ghani Biradar, who was leading the Taliban's political office, which was based in Qatar. So it is expected that Mullah Abdul Ghani Biradar will have more of a political power, perhaps in Kabul, but the other 2 deputies will also have important positions. Then members of the Leadership Council, the Taliban Leadership Council, will get positions. And the important part of the Taliban governance structure is the head of the commission or the heads of the commissions. So Taliban have the leader, deputies, and then the Leadership Council, then the Ulama Council or the Clerics Council, and then the commissions. So there are around a dozen commissions which worked as ministries, but their focus was mainly on the war. There was a commission responsible for collecting money. They called it Financial Commission. There was another commission dealing with the affairs of NGOs, another commission dealing with the affairs of prisoners, and then another one dealing with education. So it is expected that the heads of the Taliban commissions, or at least some of them, will become ministers of these sectors. For example, education, the head of the Taliban's education commission might become the minister for education. And so far, they have already appointed the governors for provinces because they already had a shadow government. And those governors who are part of the Taliban's government or shadow government became formal governors in provinces. They have also appointed district governors. The same district governors became part of this new government, and they are now district governors. But as far as the positions in Kabul are concerned, most of them are still vacant for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. They need time, they need more consultations among themselves and with other political leaders and with the international community. But I think they will have most of the power in the new government. They will appoint their own people on key government positions. Non-Taliban will get some positions, but the overall power will be with the Taliban, and they will be the main decision makers. They have also said that they would not give positions to those who served in the previous government. So officials or high-ranking officials of the previous government might not get high-ranking positions in this government or in their government. But at the lower level, in the bureaucracy, a lot of people will stay. And as far as the women are concerned, they have said that they will allow them to work in certain sectors, education, health, and some other sectors. But it is unlikely that women will get high-profile roles. For example, it is unlikely that they will become ministers or provincial governors. So this is what is expected. And then the Amir or the main leader is expected to sit in Kandahar. So his office will be in Kandahar. He will stay in Kandahar. And the executive will be based in Kabul. So that's how they will have two centers of power, Kandahar and Kabul. So the spiritual power base will be Kandahar and the executive branch will be in Kabul. And it is also possible that they will form a council. We are not sure what would they call it. It might be a Supreme Council or High Council or Leadership Council to advise the leader, or if there was an important issue to discuss or to decide upon. And it is also possible that in the future, there will be another council, maybe based in Kabul, which will be something similar to a parliament. But that's too early to establish that kind of council or a parliament, because we are not sure whether they would call this government a transitional government, a caretaker government. Most probably they will call it a caretaker government, because it will be possible in the future to bring changes or move people around or introduce more people to the government. But at least in the next few days, they will announce a government for the country. Afghanistan doesn't have a central government at the moment. So that's how it is.
So now, if I can just push you, we'll come to kind of governance issues in a bit and the structure. But you've been studying, following, spending time in Afghanistan for a very long time. You've studied the Taliban for a very long time. Is there anything in their statements, in their actions, that makes you believe that the Taliban have changed? From the time the Taliban spokesperson started getting onto television across the world, the messaging was about an inclusive government. It was about women's rights. We've already, in a period of less than 10 days, seen that watered down to selections when it comes to what an inclusive government will be. It's very unlikely today that either President Karzai or Dr. Abdullah will have any role in this government. They, of course, may not want any role in the government. We've also seen atrocities as far as women is concerned. We've seen segregation in various different parts of Afghanistan. And we've seen loose statements by Taliban commanders, which does not heed to the better managed info ops out of Doha and elsewhere. So what makes you, do you believe that the Taliban have changed at all?
Well, they have changed in certain ways. You mentioned television. I mean, this itself is a change. When the Taliban were in power in the 1990s, they had banned television. There was no television in Afghanistan at all. It was only the voice of Shariat radio, national radio, and then a few newspapers and journals. And they had also banned the internet in the 1990s. And now they have a website which has material in 5 languages. So they have become more media savvy. So that's a change. They take selfies, they have videos of their leaders, they give interviews to the Taliban media outlets and international media outlets. So technologically, and when it comes to media, they have changed a lot. But when it comes to the ideology, I think it's more or less the same. Ideology is the same. They still insist on establishing an Islamic system, respecting the values and traditions of the Afghan people. But in the meantime, they also say that we want to have good relations with the rest of the world, because they had a bad experience of isolation when they were in power in the 1990s. They don't want that. They want their leaders to travel freely in the world. They want the world to continue the assistance that they had been giving Afghanistan over the past 20 years, because they would need money. They would need financial assistance from the international community. So for that reason, they would try to be a bit moderate, but there is a limit, I think. For example, they didn't allow women to work in government offices.
Sorry, Dawood, I think your system's gone on mute for some reason. Yeah, if you could just unmute yourself. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
So the role of women in government will be another change, a minor change, I think, because they wouldn't be appointing women on high-ranking positions. But in the bureaucracy or in certain sectors like education and health, they would be allowing women to work. But it wouldn't be the kind of government or the kind of change that the international community is expecting. So Taliban will do certain things to please the international community, or just to avoid isolation, or maybe certain restrictions or other issues that will make that relations tense between the two sides. But if you give them an option between having a Taliban-led government and international assistance, or the freedom to travel in the world, so I guess they would choose the first option, because that's their main purpose: to have power in Afghanistan, to have full control over Afghanistan, and to govern Afghanistan the way they want to. So that's their main priority.
Josh, if I could just turn to you, Dawood said something where he said is that they will govern Afghanistan as for the Afghan people, but clearly the Afghan people didn't bring the Taliban in. The Taliban came in from a variety of deals, of ostensibly negotiated partnerships, and by the use of force. I think many of us in the analyst community, if you like, have been quite shocked at, say, the interviews given by people like General Nick Carter in the United Kingdom, where only a few days after Kabul fell, he came out quite brazenly and said, "Is that you mean we need to give Taliban a chance?" Zalmay Khalilzad, the chief negotiator and the part of the United States, has again taken a somewhat more empathetic view of the Taliban. So if I could just ask you, as someone who's followed this patch for long, do you think that the Taliban has changed, and what is it that gives these kind of negotiators the kind of confidence to come out with their views?
Thanks, Rudy. It's great to be with you again and to be with Dawood in this discussion. To step back just a moment, I think to your first question, it's important to recognize that the formation of the government really hasn't been particularly slow. I mean, many countries around the world take a lot longer to form a government. The United States forming a cabinet is a painfully laborious process, and the kind of deliberations that we're seeing by the Taliban in these early days after their consolidation of power, I think if anything, is the mark of a relatively confident and certainly a coherent organization that is seeking to consult internally and externally and navigate some of the trade-offs that it's going to face. As Dawood said, we don't know exactly what the structure is going to look like, but we have a pretty good idea what the overall organizational paradigm is going to be. And the Taliban were able to be successful on the battlefield because of their organizational coherence. They'll face different kinds of challenges in governance, of course, but I think some of that coherence is likely to translate. As to your question about whether the Taliban have changed, I think there is an analytic answer, which Dawood provided quite adeptly, which is that in certain respects, the organization is certainly more savvy. It doesn't want to return to the kind of isolation experience that it had in the 1990s. But then there's a sort of diplomatic, tactical answer. I think that's what you were getting at with Khalilzad's comments and others. Regardless of what one thinks the Taliban are likely to do, how they're going to behave toward women and minority groups, the kind of the kind of freedoms we would all like to see in Afghanistan, regardless of what you think that answer is going to be, there is some diplomatic logic to giving the Taliban a chance to follow through with some of the more positive hortatory statements that they've made about respecting Afghans' ability to travel abroad with the proper paperwork and give women a place in society. One can be pretty pessimistic about how this is going to look in 6 months or a year or 5 years with respect to some of these rights and conditions, and also take a diplomatic approach that says, let's try to hold the Taliban leadership to the statements that they have made and the commitments that they have made, and use this as part of a broader approach to apply the leverage that the international community has, which we can talk more about later, the financial leverage, the political leverage, in an attempt to shape, probably at the margins, but to shape the way in which this Taliban government actually governs.
Okay, Yash, thanks. We'll come back to sort of what international leverage is left and how that might shape the Taliban government. But if I just stick to the structure of government, Dawood, the quick question is, how do you see the so-called resistance surviving inside of Afghanistan? So there's one province, the Panjshir, which seems to be holding out. Amrullah Saleh, Masood's son, and a range of others, perhaps General Bismillah Khan and others, seems to be, they're armed. There were clashes last night, as we hear from reports, with the Taliban. The Panjshir has been cut off, from what I understand, and Amrullah Saleh has been violently tweeting about the humanitarian crises that will unfold. There's no access to medicines, to food. The Taliban have completely cut off the Panjshir. But what do you see as the future of this resistance?
I mean, this resistance is, again, different from the previous resistance in the 1990s, because in the past, the Taliban had not captured Panjshir and then Takhar province and Badakhshan province, so they had access to Tajikistan and they had a wider area to move around in. But this time, Panjshir is surrounded by all sides. So Badakhshan, Takhar, Nuristan, and then Parwan province from this side have all been captured by the Taliban. So that's why it is a big challenge for the resistance this time. But I think, generally speaking, the Taliban will face three major or main security challenges in the immediate and near future. One is coming from the Islamic State Khorasan group. They have been fighting against each other for the past 5 years or so in Afghanistan. So that will stay. Taliban will have this security challenge. The second challenge they might face in the near future will be local uprisings and small-scale skirmishes, such as the ones already seen in Parwan, Baghlan, and Panjshir. And the third will be targeted assassinations and guerrilla attacks against Taliban officials. So these are the three security challenges that I can see for the Taliban. But the intensity of such a position and resistance depends on three factors. One is the resolve and resilience of the opposing sides, whether it is the Panjshir resistance or ISIS Khorasan or other such groups. And the second factor is the degree of external support for local opposition. So are they able to attract financial, military support from outside or not? Or are foreigners able to give that kind of support to the armed opposition? Because geography is also a factor. If they don't have access, then it will be hard, especially road access. The third factor is the Taliban's policies and governance style, and the degree of their tolerance and accommodation of demands and aspirations of various segments of the Afghan society. So these are the factors that will be important when it comes to the intensity of armed opposition. But the fight in Panjshir has been going on for the past 1 week or so. But in the meantime, there are contacts between the two sides. President Karzai and Dr. Abdullah are also asking for talks and peaceful resolution of this crisis. So there are still hopes that the talks will be successful. But the Taliban have also made a decision that they want to have control over Panjshir as well, because they can't leave Panjshir alone. So this is what they've been saying. And there's also pressure from within the Taliban on the leadership to decide the issue of Panjshir. But there are also calls from within the country, even from within the Taliban, that we need to resolve this peacefully. So it depends on the two sides, how flexible they are, how much what compromise are they willing to do. So, but the contexts are still there.
Thanks. And just one question before I move to Josh on Pakistan. Dawood, there are many of us on the outside who've worked with different people inside of Afghanistan, you more than most. Many of them there are young people, for instance, who were young ministers in the government, and the Ghani government was notoriously known for bringing in a lot of people. So sort of a reverse brain drain, he was able to get a lot of people sort of back in. These people worked in security agencies, they worked in various government departments, and many of them have had to leave because of the threat to life. Do you foresee any kind of arrangement by which the Taliban would allow many of the young talent of Afghanistan to return to their families and live safely after?
They will make an announcement inviting all these Afghans who were already abroad or those who went recently. But then again, it depends on the policies of the Taliban, how open they are, how much accommodation they can provide to these Afghans. And the restrictions are also important. What restrictions do they impose when it comes to media freedom and other social freedoms? So it is up to the Taliban as well. But they will make an announcement, I'm sure of that, inviting the Afghan diaspora to help rebuild Afghanistan. But it is a big brain drain. I mean, in the past month, maybe 200,000 Afghans left the country via Kabul airport, and then the border crossings with Iran and Pakistan and Central Asian countries. And this trend continues. If you go to the border crossing in Torkham and in Kandahar, in Chaman, so there are thousands of people waiting to cross the border. And it's the same situation on the border with Iran, in Nimroz, in Herat. So my guess is, it's a wild guess, that around 500,000 people will eventually leave Afghanistan in the next maybe few months or a year. But how many will come back? I doubt that many will come back. Maybe a few hundred, maybe a few thousands will come back. But these people, once they have left the country, most of them wouldn't be able to return for family reasons, for political reasons, and for other reasons. But Taliban will face a challenge running the government smoothly, because these people who are part of the government, they had some experience. So they would need skillful people, skilled Afghans to run the government and provide services and meet the expectations of the people. So they will make an announcement when the government is formed that they would welcome those who have gone abroad.
Okay, thanks. I wouldn't expect anyone to come back to Afghanistan, honestly, under these conditions. But Josh, in this whole question of the Taliban running the government and being able to do so, meeting international obligations, what role do you see for Pakistan? You've studied Pakistan better than most. The Taliban today are a very different beast to what they were in the 1990s. There are global connections, access. Various Taliban leaders now have an open line to China, to Russia, to troikas and very many different conglomerations. So what is the role that Pakistan plays inside of Afghanistan? There's, of course, the conventional understanding that everything inside of Afghanistan at the moment is being run by the Pakistanis via, say, the Haqqani network. I mean, there are these incredible pictures of Anas Haqqani meeting with Abdullah Karzai, a prisoner terrorist, designated terrorist today. He's openly tweeting. So the entire kind of mindset in which I think people have studied this conflict have changed. But what's the role for Pakistan?
Well, you're right. There is sort of an exaggerated view that the Taliban were and remain essentially Pakistani puppets. That is, I think, wildly overdrawn. The Taliban have, certainly with Pakistani support, created over time a very coherent and organic insurgency. And for Pakistan, this is very much a mixed outcome. For years in talking with Pakistani officials, I had a very clear sense that the Pakistani security services knew what outcome they did not want in Afghanistan. They did not want the type of governments they saw with the Karzai or Ghani governments that were seen as being close to India and supported by the West. But they had a much hazier view of what they did want. And really what they wanted was something unattainable. They wanted a Taliban sympathetic government that was Pashtun-led, but not Pashtun nationalist in an ethnic sense. It was antagonistic toward India in a deep way, but acceptable to the international donor community. I mean, we should not be surprised, the Pakistanis should not be surprised that they did not get the unattainable, even as the Taliban took power. So I think, in one sense, the Pakistanis will retain some influence, and they have deep networks with the Taliban at the political and military levels. But in another sense, there are very much risks here for Pakistan. There are risks that, if the Taliban government really cannot find a pathway to international legitimacy, that presents some challenges to Pakistan to have it's really a highly isolated state on its border. There's the very real risk of humanitarian spillover and refugee flows into Pakistan if Afghanistan proceeds from being an economic mess to a real economic catastrophe in the coming years. And then there's from Pakistan's point of view, the very mixed risk of that the Taliban victory will galvanize jihadi groups across the region. Now, in some ways, this could advance Pakistan's own longstanding goals of mobilizing jihadi groups against India, Punjabi groups and Lashkar-e-Taiba and the like. But on the other hand, some of that energy could very much galvanize groups like the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan and ISKP and others that are not friendly to the Pakistani state. Right? So, as it deals with these groups, I think, you mentioned, Rudy, very aptly that the Taliban, while they have benefited enormously from Pakistani support, Pakistani advisory services, and safe haven, the Taliban have also taken steps, particularly over the last 5 to 7 years, to make sure that they're not under the thumb of the Pakistanis, to diversify their contacts and their options. They developed other kinds of safe haven in Iran. They rolled out a very impressive diplomatic strategy engaging great powers and small countries alike throughout the region. And they gave themselves the kind of flexibility that now, having gained power in Afghanistan, they are really not particularly reliant on Pakistan. They're certainly not entirely reliant on Pakistan. And Pakistan will retain some influence, but it doesn't have enormous leverage in the current context. And I think what we're seeing right now is Pakistan grappling not only with how to talk about the Taliban victory, not only with how to stage its diplomatic recognition of the Taliban government if and when that comes, but more broadly how to use its influence in this new environment.
So, Josh, you've studied the Haqqanis for quite some time, both in scholarship as well as in practice. The fact that the Haqqanis have perhaps an oversized role to play in this new government, at least in the Kabul side of things, and that's all the signals that we're getting. I mean, reports from the ground make clear that it was Anas Haqqani and Khalil Haqqani who were in charge of the security for Kabul when the forces went in. They were in charge of trying to see if some kind of an inclusive system could work out. They were the front pictures, shaking hands and, dare I say, even hugging people like Dr. Abdullah and Karzai, although I'm told that behind that kind of outreach, there were clear threats that were made to both. But when you see pictures and images such as that, and given the Haqqanis' very close relationship with the Pakistani state or the deep state, doesn't this worry you as an analyst sitting in Washington, D.C., a designated terrorist organization in power in an Islamic emirate, close to a Pakistani state which has harbored groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Taiba? There are reports doing the rounds to say that both JEM and LET are now well entrenched in Kunar and different parts of Afghanistan. So just keeping regional stability in mind, and obviously there's the predictable kind of question that I have on India's security in mind. Doesn't this worry you?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I think some of the deepest concerns are the ones that you outlined. You know, India is facing a situation, and the United States as a close partner of India, in which those militant groups that are most focused on India, Jaish, Lashkar, and others, who have found space to have made space to operate and been welcomed by the Haqqanis and others, particularly in eastern Afghanistan, over the last 10 years, that they'll be able to run the table, that they'll have freedom to operate, and that, you know, the United States, Europe, India, and other countries that have been most focused on these groups are not going to have really meaningful leverage to deal with them. I think that's really the principal concern. You know, there are also just real complications for the United States in seeing the Haqqanis emerge in more public, visible ways in the Afghan government. The Haqqanis are in a sort of a different, higher class of designation as a terrorist organization. And, you know, as the United States thinks about the like very complicated decisions of how to deliver, you know, humanitarian assistance in the short term, long-term development support in such a way, if that's possible, that Afghanistan doesn't face an economic collapse, and then allow for some kind of, you know, macroeconomic stability and a functioning banking system that doesn't result in massive. You know, without one, you could have an economic implosion and refugee flows. All of those questions are complicated by the need to really work around the Afghan government in the short and probably in at least in the medium term. And the Haqqanis there very much complicate that.
Thanks, Josh. We've got a bunch of questions on the Afghan economy. As you can imagine, a range of questions on Pakistan, the ISI, and various organizations. But Dawood, if I can just turn to you, and I apologize to the audience, I'm not going to be able to call you out by name, but I'm going to try and club as many of your questions together as possible. There are a whole bunch of questions on the Afghan economy. Clearly, this is a priority. We're already seeing hunger on the streets of Afghanistan. There's a dire humanitarian crisis. The head of the UN's food program has been out saying is deal with whoever you need to deal with. Figure out whether you want to legitimize the Taliban government or not, but we need to get food to the nooks and corners of Afghanistan. Now, what role do you see a state like Pakistan or the Taliban's newer friends like China play in basically propping up the economy or getting it started, given the fact that for the last decade, as far as economic figures grow, there's been no growth in Afghanistan. It's a donor-led economy. I mean, without the money coming in, there is no economy.
Well, this will be one of the biggest challenges for the Taliban, apart from the governance itself, how to run the economy, the Afghan economy, and deal with the poverty and hunger and drought. Afghanistan has been in the middle of a very severe drought over the past few years. So this will be a very big challenge. And I don't think any of these regional players, including Russia and China, would be able to replace the Western countries when it comes to aid and donation. What Taliban want in the um, near future is more trade and more investment. So they would like to have China to invest in the mines and mineral sector of Afghanistan. They would also like to have connectivity when it comes to trade, regional trade. So they're banking on that as well. When there is more trade and Afghanistan will be the hub, then they'll be getting revenues. And then the third area of focus for Taliban would be these regional infrastructure projects, such as TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, the Pakistan-India pipeline, and the rail network connecting Uzbekistan with Pakistan and South Asia, Central Asia and South Asia, and then Iran with Pakistan, and the rest of South Asia. So these are the three areas that they will be focusing on: foreign investments in the mineral mining infrastructure of Afghanistan, in which China can play a big role. Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, and Russia can play a major role. The CASA, electricity grid and pipelines will be another area that they will they would like these regional countries to start work on, because so far the main problem was the security. So now they are saying that we will provide the security which they wanted. And Taliban would also like to would like China to extend its Belt and Road Initiative to Afghanistan. So this is how they can see Afghanistan when it comes to the economy. But in the meantime, they would love to have the aid, the financial assistance from the Western countries, because that's irreplaceable. None of these countries can replace that. The amount of money that had gone to Afghanistan over the past 20 years is in billions, hundreds of billions, or at least tens of billions when it comes to the development of Afghanistan. So they want to diversify. If there is less money from Western donors, so they would like to have an alternative in the form of direct investments by regional countries and more connectivity when it comes to trade, regional trade.
I mean, that's a nice wish list of what the Taliban would want. I mean, you want choices when you have those kind of opportunities. But I mean, we've been speaking to Western capitals, missions, among the 40, 45 member coalition. Nobody's going to be turning that development tap on anytime soon. It looks like everybody's taking a back seat and trying to figure out what's the best way to proceed and how do you actually get development to the people of Afghanistan minus the government of the Taliban. I mean, just think about governments like India or the United Kingdom or Germany or Australia, where you have a foreign minister who double hats as a minister for women, putting money into the Taliban's coffers for development. So if I just switch to Josh.
So sorry, Rudra, just one point quickly. You are right.
Yeah, please.
When it comes to the economic hardship, in the short term, there will be more unemployment, more poverty, and this is one of the main reasons for people leaving Afghanistan, because a lot of people have lost their jobs. So we don't know what will happen to these 300,000 members of Afghan security forces. So would they be brought back? I don't think all of them would be brought back to the security forces. And then a lot of people in the bureaucracy have lost jobs. And Taliban, I don't think, would have that many people in the government. Firstly, for affordability reason, and secondly, there were unnecessary appointments in the previous governments for different reasons. So the brain drain is one issue, but unemployment and poverty is another reason that people are leaving the country.
We've got a bunch of questions on India, but I'm just going to park them for a while. And I should just give a good warning to both my guests that I am going to end with a question on how did we get here, so that you might want to just keep that in your mind somewhere or in your pocket. But Josh, if I just switch to you, there's a lot of speculation on what's going to be the role of the United States going forward. President Biden, in a somewhat stoic stance on a range of press conferences, has made very clear that counterterrorism sort of, will play some role in the way in which the United States looks at Afghanistan in the future. Of course, many of his remarks are focused on IS Khorasan. But when it comes to development aid, when it comes to turning the back on the Afghan economy, close to $10 billion is kept in markets across the world that the US Fed has frozen at this particular point in time. How is the US actually going to use this for leverage? Is there any thinking? Is there a systematic plan? Has this been priced into the negotiated agreement that Khalilzad and others struck with the Taliban?
I think these are discussions that are in progress that aren't relying on the sort of political architecture and negotiations of what Khalilzad and his team did last year. I mean, I think that the highest priority in a way is dealing with the potential economic implosion and humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. And here the distinction between humanitarian assistance on the one hand and sort of development support is important. Humanitarian assistance is usually provided in cases like this. It can be provided off budget. It is designed to ameliorate an economic crisis of some kind. Development support, as you said, which donor countries are much more reticent to engage right now, requires engaging institutions. You have to engage institutions for sustainability. For maximum sustainability, you want things to be on budget of the government that you're supporting. That's simply not feasible right now. So I think a lot of the focus is on how to use the leverage that the United States has to provide avenues for that kind of humanitarian assistance. And then, some of that leverage, which we didn't really detail before, but I think is obvious to a lot of the viewers. U.S. Financial leverage in a dollar-denominated world, holding much of the Afghan Reserve Bank's funds being that are currently frozen. And the ability to exert influence with the IMF, the World Bank, the ability to exert influence at the UN, where many of the senior Taliban officials are still on sanctions lists, and they have travel waivers, some of which for their senior leaders expire, I think, in about 2 weeks, and 3 weeks will have to be renewed. So these are all, points of leverage that the United States is going to use to think about what we want to see on the humanitarian front, what we want to see in shaping probably just at the margins the way in which this government operates, and then eventually the United States is concerned about the evolving terrorism environment in Afghanistan. And eventually, I think there will be conversations about where interests align on issues like ISKP, and where there's some modest cooperation possible. I mean, the U.S. and Taliban for several years have, when U.S. coalition forces were in Afghanistan, they were quietly cooperating with the Taliban, often in informal ways, to target the Islamic State. And so I expect some of those lines of communication are probably quite viable at the moment.
So, Josh, so what you're saying is essentially what we could look forward to is a fairly granular, messy set of arrangements which move from counterterrorism cooperation, oversight about Taliban behavior, trying to use that leverage as effectively as possible based on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and then kind of striking across this entire segment is just the new need of Afghan people for humanitarian assistance, right? I mean, that seems to be the basic ballpark. Yeah. Do you think that in order to kind of put this in place, and I'm assuming many countries, whether it's Australia or Germany or France or India, for instance, would be much more comfortable in thinking about humanitarian assistance or even development assistance via some kind of an international vehicle, right?
Yes.
It makes it easier. Countries don't have to stick their neck out. Do you see something like an international conference or a Bond 2.0 kind of slowly kind of evolving to try and create this new compact?
I can certainly see international multilateral donor conferences. I don't think they would look like Bonn in that they wouldn't have the mandate or the influence to shape the structure of the Afghan state. That's really going to be up to the Taliban. But I do think, and I don't think there's likely to be some sort of overarching U.S. diplomatic agreement or U.S. agreement with the Taliban that hits on all of these points as part of a larger umbrella. That would be politically difficult for the United States to do at this stage. And there's just too much influx. I think we'll see a number of, there are probably a number of channels between the US government and the Taliban government on security issues, on some of the humanitarian issues, on other regional challenges. Those will continue. If there is a larger agreement, it would probably be between the UN and the new Taliban government in sorting out modalities for the delivery of humanitarian aid that other countries could then use for their aid delivery. So I think things will move slowly, both because the Taliban government is still taking shape, and because the politics of this are pretty tricky in the United States. And Biden has gotten a lot of criticism for the way that this was handled, and I don't think is in a position to say we're prepared to recognize the new government, we're prepared to have an overall framework agreement with the new government. I think it's going to be more piecemeal and progress more slowly.
All right, as you can imagine, I've got questions are pouring in with Pakistan, India, but we've only got a few minutes left. So I'm going to first ask a question in India to the both of you. There's a huge amount of discussion, as you can imagine, on where does this leave India? Will India have a diplomatic presence? Will it be able to recognize the Taliban? How does it work inside of Afghanistan minus legitimizing the government? So for the both of you who studied this patch for ages, so Dawood, if I can just start with you. And I remember you and I had a discussion about the role that India played during the Doha negotiations. You were there in February when that deal was struck between the United States and the Taliban. How do you see India's position? I mean, the Taliban have come out. I mean, their info ops is great. I mean, they've had spokespersons, head of the political office, Tanik Zaid, who've made an overture, went across on his beckoning to the Indian embassy in Doha, met with the ambassador. You had Shaheen, who's been coming out on Twitter and other places, and strangely for us in India, turning up on Indian news channels, which I genuinely never thought would happen, talking about kind of overtures to India. How do you see India's position and going forward?
I think Taliban were willing to open a dialogue channel with India in the past, but it was India's reluctance that didn't materialize. So India was reluctant to establish links with the Taliban for mainly two reasons. One was the belief that Taliban are or were Pakistani proxies. So they didn't believe the Taliban have independence. They can decide on their own. So that was one of the reasons. And the second reason was they didn't want to annoy President Ghani's government in Afghanistan, because President Ghani didn't want any country in the region, especially, to deal with the Taliban directly. Other countries had established links with the Taliban, for example, Iran, China, and Russia and Uzbekistan and others. But President Ghani or his government couldn't stop them. So India didn't want to make his relations tense with the President Ghani's government. And there was also a symbolic issue because India wanted to see President Ghani's government as the main power in Afghanistan. They didn't want to give legitimacy to the Taliban, that they are also having a role or some sort of legitimacy. So these were 2 or 3 reasons that India was reluctant. But now the Taliban are in government, or they will form their government. So it is a reality. India needs to face this reality. And Taliban are again keen to establish links with all regional players. There is a selfish reason as well. Taliban want to neutralize all the threats in the region. So they have established links with their former enemies. In the 90s, the anti-Taliban Northern Alliance had three main supporters in the region: India, Russia, and Iran. Now they have lost those two backers. Russia and Iran are now, I mean, they are now friends of the Taliban, or at least have links with the Taliban. So it is unlikely that Iran and Russia will be providing the same sort of financial and military support and diplomatic support to the resistance this time. So India is in a difficult situation this time, but Taliban will also be careful this time not to annoy India or not to host or shelter those groups which had been fighting in India. So this is what the Taliban will do to neutralize the threat and establish normal relations with all the regional players. And Taliban also want to establish links with India to give a message that they can make decisions independently. They are not dependent on Pakistan, or they don't need Pakistan's permission to do that. So that's also a reason that Taliban are keen to establish links with India. So now, in a way, the ball is now in India's court. So it's up to India now. Up to what level do they want to establish links with the Taliban? Do they recognize the government, or do they trade with Afghanistan without recognition? I mean, this is another possibility. The trade will go on. What the Taliban government would need is regional trade to go on. And most of Afghanistan exports, or a lot of it, have been going to India. So when it comes to dry fruit, fresh fruit, so the Taliban government, or Afghanistan in general, would need to keep that market. So that's why Taliban are keen to establish links with India.
Thanks, Dawood. So Josh, I mean, the ball might be in India's court, but surely it takes two to tango. I mean, at some level, why would an Indian government want to engage a Taliban leadership where we know for a fact that Lashkar-e-Taiba operatives have fought in the past in Helmand alongside various Helmandi Taliban groups? Jaish-e-Mohammed, till recently we had reports that Jaish operatives were sitting inside of Kandahar after Kabul fell. The Taliban's linkages with the Al-Qaeda are murky or unclear. The UN report of June of this year made very clear that those linkages still exist. So, I mean, a lot of groundwork needs to be done before there's any confidence, if you're sitting in New Delhi, to say is that, okay, let's try and engage these guys. As Dawood said, practically, of course, any government will today engage with the Taliban at some level, as the Indian ambassador in Qatar did with the political office head of the Taliban. There will be some kind of a transactional relationship, and that kind of makes sense. But will Pakistan allow these red lines to be crossed? I mean, that is a big question. This is not to say that the Taliban are beholden to Pakistan, but surely there are certain red lines which makes it very difficult in terms of operating space for the Taliban, no?
Yeah, let's just be honest. India is in a very bad situation here. It made a decision which you and others chronicled quite well, to keep its distance from the Taliban, even as the Taliban was ascendant as a diplomatic and military force in Afghanistan. You can run a counterfactual as to whether had India spent the last 5-7 years building some deeper political links to the Taliban, if they'd be in a different situation today, I think perhaps they would have a few more options at their disposal. But the reality is that even though Pakistan writ large has only limited points of leverage with the Taliban, significant but not all-encompassing, you can bet that Pakistan will use the leverage that they do have with the Taliban to press for their highest priorities. And their highest priorities, I think, as evident by Pakistani behavior, are to limit India's diplomatic and security influence in Afghanistan. So I think that we have to presume that Pakistan is using its influence with the Taliban to do that. And I'm really not that optimistic that the Taliban will be careful about not giving space to India-focused militant groups. I haven't seen much evidence that the Taliban is very concerned about this. I mean, it recognizes the optics of appearing to host or facilitate Al-Qaeda, It recognizes the sort of the diplomatic risks that it faces. I think it frankly faces fewer diplomatic and potentially second-order financial risks of allowing Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and others to continue to wander quite freely around much of Afghanistan and interface with the Taliban fighters. The other thing that we should remember is that, as Dawood mentioned, the enormous Afghan security forces are going to be or have been abruptly demobilized, chaotically demobilized. The Taliban forces themselves, some of them will probably be integrated into more formal kind of structures now that the Taliban in power. But there will probably be a lot of loose floating fighters who have worked for one side or the other. That provides a real recruitment opportunity for groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba. Even if those people don't operate in Kashmir or in India, they can provide the kind of support network in Afghanistan that allows those groups to take root. So I think those are real concerns. As you said, Rudy, in this, the Indian government has no reason to trust the Taliban on these issues, but it has every reason to try to make up for lost time and find places to engage on tactical security issues where there's a common concern, and to sort of slowly forge a way forward. I think India will lag the rest of the international community. We'll watch closely to see how other countries think about not necessarily recognizing the Taliban, but engaging with the Taliban, and we'll probably proceed quite cautiously.
Yeah, Josh, I think that's what sums it up. I did have a much larger question about how did we get here, but I fear that we may need another webinar for this, and perhaps we all need a little bit more time to take a step back and figure out why did Kabul fall. And I can see the number of books on shelves and the movies and journal articles that's going to be spent working on this and the tragedy that unfolded. But for now, Dawood Azami, Joshua White, thank you so much for joining us on India and the World at Carnegie India. To our audience, thank you so much. And we welcome you back next week to a new edition of India and the World, where I sit down with 4 of my counterparts from different parts of the world at Carnegie to talk about Russia, the Middle East, China, and other parts. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you.